Derek Carr has found his new home, the New Orleans Saints. Now, it's been a bit of an odd offseason for Carr, who was released by the Las Vegas Raiders after a pretty long time, but he's been a hot topic, and now he's in NOLA. Carr is signing a 4-year deal with the Saints, and it is worth a lot more than I had expected, but the layout of it is kind of interesting. It is worth $150 million, and $100 million of that is guaranteed, which kudos to Derek Carr, that is awesome for him. The Saints are in a kind of a weird, tough situation. You know, they're in a really bad salary cap spot, but Carr has structured his deal to kind of help the Saints, and a big part of that is getting $60 million at signing. New Orleans was part of the sweepstakes for Carr pretty much this whole way, but I think, at least from reports, and I think a lot of people did seem to think the Jets were the favorite there for a while, but ultimately it is the Saints. Carr is still plenty young. He turns 32 in a few weeks, and he's now finally making his way to a new team. Remember, the Raiders took him in the early second round way back in 2014, and he was the guy for the Raiders for a long time. He was even the guy that they took with that transition from Oakland to Las Vegas. He stepped in, he started for the Raiders as a rookie, and he was the starter for 9 years. Unfortunately, the Raiders were mediocre at best for the vast majority of his time there, and he did only have 2 winning seasons. In 2016, he was 12-3 behind center and was well on his way to being a serious contender for the MVP, but he ended up suffering a fractured fibula and missed the end of the year and didn't play in Oakland's playoff game, which they lost. The only time Carr has ever started in a postseason game was actually in 2021. Vegas went 10-7, and they faced the Bengals in the wild card, and they did have a shot, but Carr ended up tossing an interception that did cost the Raiders the game. After the season, he ended up signing a 3-year, $215.5 million extension that included a no-trade clause ahead of 2022, but obviously the Raiders decided to move on after 1 season, and now Derek Carr makes his way to New Orleans. I am actually a really big fan of Derek Carr to the Saints. I think the Jets still would have made more sense, and I think of all the veteran quarterbacks that may be available this offseason, especially Aaron Rodgers, I do think the Jets are the best spot. I think the Jets have the best roster, and they probably are the most win-ready team. I think New York, if they get the right quarterback in there, they can all of a sudden be a serious contender even. On the other hand, the Saints are very interesting. Derek Carr is coming from the AFC West. In the AFC West, the other quarterbacks in there last year, Justin Herbert, Patrick Mahomes, 2 of the best in the league, and Russell Wilson, who I know had a bad year, but he has proven to be elite in the past, and I still do think he's gonna fix things up, but that's not the point. Derek Carr is now stepping into the NFC South, where I would heavily make the case he just went from the worst quarterback in his division to the best quarterback in his division. The Buccaneers might be rolling the dice with Kyle Trask, or they're going to sign a veteran quarterback after Tom Brady retired. You have the Falcons, who released Marcus Mariota, so now you really have just Desmond Ridder, and you may draft the quarterback, which is also possible. And then the Panthers, who I expect to draft the quarterback and maybe sign a veteran or re-sign maybe, Sam Darnold for another year. I think there's a much higher chance now that Derek Carr wins his division than there was going to be for the next 3-4 years if he did stay in Las Vegas, just because Patrick Mahomes is king, and behind Patrick Mahomes, Justin Herbert's also a very good player. I think the Saints do fit him very well. It's a very different Saints team than the past. Obviously, Sean Payton is no longer there. It's a Dennis Allen-led team, so it's very different, but I do think that a lot of the same, core principles are there. I think the Saints have still, for the most part, outperformed how they should, even with Dennis Allen. I would view Derek Carr as an immediate upgrade at quarterback, back, and he does make things kind of interesting. Andy Dalton is going to be a free agent, and I expect him to sign elsewhere, probably be a good veteran backup for a team like the Panthers or the Falcons, who are going to draft somebody and then move on. So Dalton is already out the door. What it does make very interesting is the situation with Jameis Winston. Winston has actually had some really good moments, I've thought, in New Orleans. I think him and Derek Carr are pretty close in terms of their actual play on the field. I would say that Carr is definitely more consistent. Jameis Winston, maybe with like a higher ceiling, like when he's at his best, he's really, really good, but he has a lot of, he has a lot of highs, he has a lot of lows. Carr, I think, is a little more consistent. I think that might be what the Saints need, is just some kind of realm of consistency. So I like the sign. I think it's really good for New Orleans. I think they're objectively just going to be a much better football team next year that maybe can win the NFC South. I do think there is some excitement of like what he's walking into, but I also think he had a very good supporting cast around him last year with the Raiders. Obviously, Josh Jacobs was one of, if not the best running back in football a year ago. He was fantastic. Contract was expiring. Sometimes that can give you the little push. Obviously, he had Devontae Adams, who is one of the best of the best. That's just how it is. Adams is a top 5 wide receiver. And even with those pieces, there were still a lot of issues. But I think there were a lot of issues just with the Raiders in general. So I think the question there is, where did the problem stem from? Was it a Josh McDaniels problem? Was it Josh McDaniels, settling in his first year in Las Vegas? And I don't have that answer. There are some solid pieces in New Orleans for him to work with. I think the most exciting piece, I would say, is probably going to be Chris Olave. The Saints took him last year in the first round for a reason, and he was very, very good. He probably would have won Rookie of the Year if it wasn't for his Ohio State teammate, Garrett Wilson, playing even better in New York for the Jets. Olave is obviously your clear one there, and then past Olave, you have Jarvis Landry in the slot. He's just a really good, healthy safety blanket, and I think why he's so important is because we saw Carr with that little safety blanket, Hunter Renfrow. So I think Jarvis Landry can kind of fill that role and kind of be that healthy, good spot for Derek Carr. At running back, obviously Alvin Kamara is one of the best of the best, and he's also just unique in many ways. He's not just a running back. He can also stretch out wide, kind of do whatever you need him to do. They even put him in pass pro sometimes. Alvin Kamara is kind of the do everything back in today's NFL, and I think, that having alone should be really nice and comfortable for Derek Carr, because as good as Josh Jacobs was, for the most part, that's just a running out of the backfield guy who was thrashing defenses, don't get me wrong, but that was his primary role. I think one of my biggest concerns is going to be offensive line. Derek Carr didn't have the best offensive line last year. At least to start the season, the Raiders ended up getting much, much better down the stretch. Now, all of a sudden, Derek Carr is going from a Raiders team that didn't have the best offensive line all of a sudden to a Saints team whose offensive line was just really, really bad last season. Hopefully, that's something that they can fix up, whether that's in free agency or it's at the draft. And the problem with free agency is the cap. What's going to happen with the cap? How are the Saints going to figure it out? They are in essentially salary cap hell right now, and I think they're going to get out of it, and I think there's going to be 2 big cuts that are going to get them there. Jameis Winston, I now fully believe, is going to be a cap casualty after the signing of Derek Carr. It just makes sense that Jameis Winston is going to get cut. It would save a good amount against the salary cap, and there's really no need to be paying your backup quarterback more than $10 million. So I think that is probably going to be the solution that New Orleans goes with there. On the opposite side of that, I would be shocked if Michael Thomas is still a Saint once the season starts up. Michael Thomas has currently the biggest cap hit of any player in the NFL. Yes, higher than Patrick Mahomes, higher than actual quarterbacks that, by the way, have been playing consistently over the last 2 years. Fully expect the Saints to just get rid of him. I think the Saints have known that the writing is on the wall with Michael Thomas there, so bringing up Michael Thomas in the conversation of Derek Carr's future does not make any sense. He's not going to be there. I do have a decent amount of hope for the future of the New Orleans Saints now. I do think the Saints needed to sign someone, unless they wanted to roll the dice with Jameis Winston one more season, which I wouldn't really have minded, but I do think that just objectively, like, Andy Dalton did outplay him last year, and I don't necessarily view him as an amazing quarterback. So I think a clear upgrade was available in Derek Carr, even though it might not be a seismic upgrade. It might be, kind of a little bump up. I think it was still the right call to go ahead, get Derek Carr, bring him in, and see if this Saints team that has some good pieces, has some okay young pieces, can kind of start figuring some things out. And I think that they very well may be the favorite to win the NFC South come regular season. I'm sure we're going to talk about the Raiders later on this channel once it comes to whatever they are doing at quarterback. I still don't love that they got rid of Derek Carr. I think finding a replacement better than Derek Carr is something that is very, very difficult to do in today's league. I think you can probably make the argument he's a top 15 quarterback, better like a top half quarterback starting in the NFL. He's right around there. He's one of those good but not great, gotta put talent around him, but he can win you some football games if he's put in the right spot, and he has already proven that he can do that. At the same time, I respect the Raiders are going to try to shoot for the stars, get a guy in the draft, and really try to have a just shoot for an elite quarterback, see what happens, and see if they can turn it into an actual contender. Unfortunately, Derek Carr was part of the problem, and they had to move on, but I'm excited that he has a new start in New Orleans, and I think the Saints could actually be a pretty solid team this season, and I think Derek Carr will have a big part to do in that.